Lieutenant Davis's fist connected with Jake's jaw so hard, the crack echoed off every concrete wall in that camp. And for one long, breathless second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A room full of soldiers, trained fighters, combat veterans, and every single one of them just stood there, staring at the quiet man who hadn't swung back. What Davis didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the calm in Jake's eyes wasn't weakness. It was a countdown. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. If you're new here, hit subscribe and buckle in, because this one will stay with you. Jake Mercer showed up to Fort Calloway on a Tuesday morning with a duffel bag, a thermos of black coffee, and the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable. Not the quiet of a man with nothing to say, the quiet of a man who had already said everything worth saying, to oceans, to sand, to darkness, and had decided a long time ago that words were only worth spending when they mattered. He signed in at the front gate, handed over his contractor credentials to a young private who barely looked old enough to shave, and followed a bored-looking sergeant across the gravel yard toward the main training complex. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make small talk. He just walked, thermos in hand, boots barely making a sound on the loose stone, his eyes moving, slowly, methodically, across every corner of the compound, the way a man's eyes do when they've been trained never to stop moving. The private at the gate had glanced at his paperwork and then looked up at him like he was trying to solve a math problem. "Civilian contractor," the private had said, reading aloud like he needed to hear it to believe it. "That's what it says," Jake replied. Not cold, not warm, just even. The private stamped the form and handed it back without another word, and that was more or less how Jake preferred it. He was 44 years old. He had a daughter named Lily, who was 7, who liked dinosaurs more than she liked dolls, who made him peanut butter sandwiches on Sunday mornings with too much peanut butter and not enough bread, and who had recently informed him with absolute certainty that her stuffed triceratops, Gerald, was definitely smarter than most adults. Jake thought Gerald was probably right about that. Lily was staying with his sister Carol for the 3 weeks he'd be on contract at Calloway. He'd called her the night before he left, and she'd said, "Daddy, are there dinosaurs where you're going?" And he'd said, "No, baby, but I'll look." And she'd said, "Okay, but don't get eaten." And then she'd handed the phone to Gerald so Gerald could say goodbye. He'd said goodbye to a stuffed triceratops for 30 seconds and meant every word of it. That was his life now. That was the life he'd built from the wreckage of the one before it. And it wasn't a lesser life. It wasn't a consolation prize. It was the most important thing he'd ever been assigned. And he treated it with every ounce of the same discipline and focus he'd once given to operations that he still couldn't talk about in public. He didn't come to Fort Calloway to be impressive. He came because the Department of Defense needed someone with his specific background to help assess and refine the physical conditioning program for a new unit being groomed for overseas deployment. Evaluate the training protocols. Flag inefficiencies. Make recommendations. Do it quietly. Do it professionally. Go home to his daughter. Simple enough. He should have known nothing at a military installation is ever simple. The training bay was already in motion when Jake walked in with Sergeant Holloway, the liaison who'd been assigned to show him around. 22 soldiers in various stages of a circuit drill. Weighted pull-ups, rope climbs, tire flips, box jumps, moving with the kind of synchronized aggression that came from weeks of being broken down and built back up. Jake stood at the edge of the room and watched, not with judgment, just with attention. He could see 3 things immediately that weren't working. A form issue on the weighted carry that was going to put someone's lower back out inside of 2 weeks. a rest interval that was too short for the load-to-body weight ratios he was clocking in his head, and a rope climb technique that two of the soldiers were using that was efficient in the short term, but would torch their grip endurance before any real operational demand. He made a mental note of all three. He didn't say anything. Not yet. "This is the primary unit you'll be evaluating," Holloway said beside him, keeping his voice low and professional. "Good group. Hard workers. A few real standouts." "I can see that," Jake said, and he meant it. "The officer running the session today is Lieutenant Davis." Holloway said it the way a man says something when he's trying to be neutral about something he's not neutral about. "He's been in charge of the conditioning program for the last 8 months. Jake didn't miss the tone. "He know I'm coming?" Holloway cleared his throat. "He knows a contractor is coming to evaluate the program. He's been briefed on the purpose. But he has opinions," Holloway said carefully, "about outside evaluators." Jake nodded once. He'd met men like that before. Usually, in his experience, the men most threatened by outside eyes were the ones with the most to hide. Not corruption necessarily, but pride. The particular and very dangerous pride of a man who'd confused never being challenged with being beyond challenge. "I'll stay out of the way," Jake said. "Just observing today." "Appreciate it," Holloway said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. Lieutenant Marcus Davis was, by any objective measure, a physically impressive man. 6'2", built like he'd been assembled in a laboratory designed to intimidate, with a jaw like a cinder block, and a voice that he'd clearly spent time cultivating into the precise frequency required to make people feel small. He moved through the training bay like a man who believed every room he walked into became, by virtue of his presence, his room. Jake had known men like Davis, too. A different variety than the insecure ones, these. These were the men who had been told they were exceptional early and often, who had the physical talent to partially justify that belief, and who had never encountered an obstacle that reframed their understanding of what exceptional actually meant. They could be great, men like that. In the right circumstances, shaped by the right experiences, they could become remarkable leaders. They could also become a very specific kind of problem. Davis was running the circuit with his arms crossed, barking corrections and encouragements in roughly equal measure, when he noticed Jake standing at the edge of the bay. His eyes did what dominant men's eyes do. They measured, quickly and automatically, the way a dog sizes up another dog in a park. Jake was 5'11", not imposing, medium build, the kind that wore normal clothes without looking like he was trying to hide anything, but also without advertising anything. His hair had started going silver at the temples. He was holding a thermos. He looked, if you weren't paying attention, and Davis wasn't, like a man who worked in an office and had taken a wrong turn. Davis went back to his unit, didn't acknowledge Jake, didn't introduce himself. Jake noted that too, filed it away. 40 minutes into the session, Davis called a water break and walked toward Holloway with the loose, confident stride of a man who owned the floor he was walking on. "This him?" Davis said. Not to Jake, to Holloway, like Jake wasn't standing right there. Holloway opened his mouth, but Jake answered first, calmly. "Jake Mercer. Good to meet you, Lieutenant." He extended his hand. Davis looked at it for a half-second too long. Long enough for everyone in the room who was paying attention to notice, and then shook it, briefly, loosely. The handshake of a man who wanted you to know he was doing you a favor by participating. "Holloway says you're here to evaluate the program," Davis said, still not quite making eye contact, looking somewhere around Jake's left ear. "Assess and make recommendations, yes." Davis crossed his arms again. "You have a military background?" "I do." "Army? Air Force?" "Navy." Davis's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. Navy. He said it the way certain army men say Navy, with a very specific and ancient institutional contempt. What rate? Jake looked at him. SEAL. A flicker. Quick. Gone. Right, Davis said. He uncrossed his arms, recrossed them the other direction. Well, I've been running this program for 8 months, and we have the best conditioning metrics on the base. So I'm curious what exactly you're expecting to find. Jake kept his voice completely even. I'll let the data tell me. Davis studied him for a moment. Then he made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, somewhere in between, and turned back to his unit, raising his voice to a boom that filled the whole bay. Break's over. Let's go. We're not here to sightsee. Jake sipped his coffee. The rest of the morning passed without incident. Jake observed. He took notes on a small pad, handwritten, old habit, and stayed methodically out of everyone's way, which was harder than it sounds in a training bay full of 22 moving bodies and one lieutenant who seemed to expand to fill whatever space he occupied. He noticed things. He always noticed things. He noticed that Davis was a genuinely good motivator. He had real charisma with the soldiers, a gift for reading the room's energy and calibrating his intensity accordingly. When the group was flagging, Davis found it and turned it. That was real skill. That was worth acknowledging. He also noticed that Davis ran the drills with an iron grip on every variable: timing, formation, correction, progression. And that this control, while impressive on paper, was quietly suffocating the group's ability to self-regulate under pressure. They were conditioning themselves to look for external cues instead of developing internal ones. That was going to be a problem the moment the external cue wasn't there. He wrote it all down. At noon, Davis called the session and dismissed the unit to the mess hall. He walked past Jake without stopping. Sergeant Holloway appeared at Jake's elbow. "How's it looking?" "Lot of good things," Jake said honestly. "Couple of things worth discussing. I can set up a meeting with Davis and the CO for tomorrow morning if that works." Holloway nodded and started moving. Then he stopped, turned back, lowered his voice. "Hey, don't take this morning personally. Davis he's protective of his program." "I know," Jake said. "He's a good officer. He's just protective," Jake said again, with the faintest uptick of something at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. "I know." The afternoon session started at 1400. This time, Davis had the group in the open yard, a different kind of circuit, more tactical, incorporating weighted vests and short-distance sprints between obstacle elements. Jake stood off to the side with his notepad, and for the first 20 minutes, everything was exactly as professional and uneventful as the morning had been. And then one of the soldiers, a young private named Reeves, barely 22, lean and focused and clearly one of the standouts Holloway had mentioned, went down on the sprint transition with a knee issue. Not catastrophic, but wrong. And Jake could see from 15 feet away that the kid had been compensating on that knee for at least 2 sessions, which meant Davis's program had missed it, or ignored it. Or, and this was the one that made Jake's jaw tighten slightly, pushed through it. Davis crouched over Reeves for approximately 4 seconds, confirmed the kid could stand, and told him to walk it off and get back in formation. Jake kept his face neutral. He wrote one word on his pad: Reeves. But Davis had noticed him writing, and that, right there, was when something shifted in the room. Davis stood, and when he turned toward Jake, the affable commander's mask had slipped exactly 1 degree. "Something to add?" he said. loud enough for the nearest half of the unit to hear. Jake looked up from his pad. No. Because you've been writing all day. If you've got a concern, this is the time. Jake held his gaze. My notes are for the report. I'll share them with you and the CO tomorrow morning. I'd rather hear them now. There it was. The line that was less a request and more a test. Push back or fold. Let's see what you're made of. Jake was familiar with the test. He'd administered variations of it himself, in circumstances that would make this training yard look like a playground. He capped his pen, looked at Davis with the same even, unreadable expression he'd worn all day. Private Reeves has been compensating on his left knee for at least 2 sessions, Jake said. Calm, measured. Not an accusation, just a fact laid on the table. He should come out of the circuit and get it looked at. Every soldier in earshot stopped moving. The air changed. Davis walked toward him. Not fast, deliberately. Each step telegraphing something. With respect, Davis said, the word respect landing like it had a second meaning. You are a contractor, a civilian. You do not give directives to my soldiers in my training program. Are we clear? We are, Jake said. I'm giving you an observation, Lieutenant. What you do with it is your call. Davis stopped 2 feet in front of him. He was close enough now that the height difference was noticeable. Close enough to make the point without saying it. My call, Davis repeated. Good, because that's exactly how this works. He held the eye contact for one long beat, the way dominant men do when they want to watch you look away first, and then turned back to his unit. Reeves, on your feet. You've got 5 more reps. Reeves got to his feet. Jake wrote something else on his pad. He couldn't have known, standing there in that yard under an indifferent afternoon sky, that the next 10 minutes were going to rewrite how every person in that yard understood the words strength and weakness for the rest of their careers. He hadn't planned for it. He hadn't wanted it. He had done, from the first moment he walked through the gate at Fort Calloway, everything a professional is supposed to do. Stayed in his lane, kept his voice measured, kept his ego on the shelf where it belonged. But there are men in this world who interpret restraint as retreat, who see composure and read it as vacancy, who cannot conceive, at some fundamental level, that a man who doesn't fight you is choosing not to fight you, rather than being unable to. Davis walked back toward Jake 2 minutes later, and this time he wasn't walking alone. He was walking with the whole weight of his pride and his authority and his 8-month investment in a program someone had just quietly implied wasn't perfect. You know what I think? Davis said, and his voice had lost whatever professional gloss it still had. I think you came in here with a list of things to criticize because that's what contractors do. Because they can't actually run a program themselves anymore. Because somewhere, between the Navy and the desk job they're at now, they lost whatever made them useful. Some of the soldiers found very interesting things on the ground to look at. A few looked at Jake. Jake looked at Davis. Okay, Jake said. Just that. Quiet even. Completely undefensive. And that, okay, was the thing that broke something loose in Davis. Okay, Davis repeated. That's what you've got? That's what I've got. Davis stepped closer. One step. The kind of step that civilian lawyers call encroachment, and military men call something else entirely. I've got soldiers watching me right now, Davis said, voice dropping lower, which somehow made it carry further. And I need them to understand something. I need them to understand that their commanding officer does not take directives from a man who shows up with a thermos and a notepad and tells him how to run a program that's produced better numbers than anything this base has seen in 3 years. Then tell them that, Jake said. You don't need me to make your point for you. It happened fast. Davis's hand shot out and grabbed Jake by the front of his shirt, a fistful of cotton and collar, and shoved. Jake took one step back, absorbed it. His face didn't change. The yard went absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to decide this was the moment to take a break. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. And then Davis swung. It wasn't a wild swing. Davis was a trained man. It was controlled, powerful, short arc, the kind of punch a man throws when he's done talking and has committed to a different language entirely. His fist connected with Jake's jaw on the left side, with a crack that snapped heads around from 40 feet away. Jake's head turned with it. His feet stayed planted. He straightened. He looked at Davis, and in his eyes, no anger, no humiliation, no shock, just that quiet, that terrible, specific quiet. The kind that comes not from a man who doesn't know what to do next, but from a man who is very carefully deciding whether to do it. For 3 seconds, long enough to feel like a full minute to every person watching, Jake just stood there, jaw already reddening, eyes completely still. And the watching soldiers, who were young and trained and combat-ready, felt something move through the yard that none of them had a word for yet, though some of them would find words for it later, in bunk rooms and mess halls and late-night phone calls home. The word most of them would eventually land on was gravity. Like the world had just shifted a fraction of a degree on its axis. Like the man they'd written off as the quiet guy with the thermos had just, without moving a single muscle, become the most dangerous person in the yard. Davis stared at him, and for the first time all day, maybe for the first time in a long time, Marcus Davis didn't know what came next. He should have stopped there. He didn't. Davis should have stopped. Every person in that yard knew it. The soldiers who had gone still mid-rep, weights frozen in their hands. Sergeant Holloway, standing at the far edge of the yard, who had taken one step forward and then stopped himself, reading the room the way experienced men read rooms, with the quiet understanding that there are moments when intervention makes things worse. Even the private by the gate, too far away to hear anything, had gone still. In that particular way people go still when they sense, without being able to explain it, that something fundamental is happening nearby. Davis should have stopped. He didn't know that yet, but he was about to learn it. He looked at Jake, at the jaw that was already darkening, at the eyes that hadn't changed, at the absolute, almost inhuman stillness of the man in front of him. And something in Davis's brain did what pride always does when it's cornered. It doubled down. "That's what I thought," Davis said. The words were automatic, muscle memory of dominance. He'd said words like that 100 times in his life, and they'd always done their job. Put the line in the sand, made the hierarchy visible, reminded whoever was on the other side of it that there was an order to things, and he was at the top of it. But Jake didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. And the words just hung there in the yard air like smoke, dissolving into nothing. Davis felt it, the shift, the way the room had stopped being his room somewhere in the last 30 seconds, and he hadn't noticed until right now. He could feel the eyes of his unit on his back, and he knew, with the instinct of a man who'd spent his career reading groups, that they weren't looking at him the way they usually looked at him. He needed to close this out, right now, hard and clean. "You want to file a report?" Davis said. "File a report. You want to call the CO? Call him. But you're standing in my yard, in my training program, and you don't get to stand there and silently judge everything I've built without saying something to my face." Jake's head tilted exactly 1 degree. "I said something to your face," he said. "About Reeves. That's why we're here." Something moved across Davis's expression. Fast. Gone before anyone could fully name it. "Reeves is fine," Davis said. "Reeves has a grade 2 strain building in his left knee," Jake said. "He's been compensating since at least Wednesday. If he finishes this week's load without intervention, you're looking at a minimum 6-week recovery, possibly surgery." He paused. "But yeah, he's fine." The unit was not pretending to find anything else interesting anymore. Every eye in the yard was on this. On the two of them. On the space between them that felt, somehow, smaller than it had been a minute ago, even though neither man had moved. Davis's jaw worked. "You diagnosed his knee from 15 feet away." "I watched the way he lands his left foot coming off the box jump," Jake said. "Been doing it the same way for 2 sessions. That's not an acute injury. That's accumulated load on a joint that's already compensating for something. Whether it's an old issue or a new one, you'd know better than me. But it needs to be looked at." A few of the soldiers exchanged glances. Not conspiratorially, more the way people exchange glances when something they've been thinking privately gets said out loud. Davis saw it. Of course he saw it. Men like Davis always see the room reacting. He stepped forward. This time Jake held his ground, and Davis stopped with less than a foot between them. Jake could smell the sweat and the aggression coming off him in waves, could feel the physical weight of the man's presence, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. "I'm going to say this once," Davis said, voice low now, the public performance stripped away. Just the two of them, and whatever this actually was. "I don't know who you were. I don't know what you did in whatever capacity the Navy used you in, but that was before. And this, right here, is my program, my unit, and my yard. And you are a contractor, a civilian, a man with a notepad and opinions. And I don't take directions from men with notepads and opinions. Are we done?" Jake looked at him for a long moment. "Whenever you're ready," Jake said. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't sarcastic. It was just there. Simple and absolute, and somehow more maddening than any comeback Davis had braced for. Davis grabbed him, both hands this time, fists closing on the front of Jake's shirt, pulling him forward with enough force to send a lighter man stumbling. Jake moved with it, took the momentum without fighting it, feet barely shifting on the gravel. "Does anything get through to you?" Davis said, and there was something new in his voice now. Not just authority, something raw, something that in a different man, in a different context, might have been desperation. "Or do you just stand there and take it?" "I'm standing here," Jake said. "That's taking it." And then Davis threw the second punch. This one wasn't at his jaw. It was lower. A short, brutal shot to the ribs. The kind that folds men. The kind that puts the air out and makes the body remember that it is, at the end of everything, just a body. Jake exhaled. Hard. His arm dropped against his side for a half-second, and several of the watching soldiers made involuntary sounds, sharp intakes of breath, the start of protests that nobody finished. Davis stepped back, watching, waiting for Jake to fold. Jake straightened. He pressed his lips together once, breathed through his nose, and then he looked at Davis with those same quiet eyes and said nothing. "Stay down," one soldier muttered, and it took a full second to realize he wasn't talking to Jake. Davis heard it. His head snapped toward the group. "Who said that?" Silence. Boots on gravel. Nobody moved. "I said, who said that?" Still nothing. But the silence itself was a kind of answer. 22 soldiers who had lined up every morning for 8 months to follow this man's commands. And right now, not one of them was willing to throw a teammate under the bus to save Davis from himself. Davis turned back to Jake. "This is what you wanted," Davis said. "Coming in here with your little notepad, making your little observations, waiting for me to give you something to put in your report. Right? This is exactly what you wanted." "No," Jake said. "It really isn't." "Then what do you want?" And Jake, quiet, still, jaw going purple along one side, ribs aching in a way that would produce a bruise the size of a dinner plate by morning. Jake looked at Davis for a long moment with something in his eyes that Davis, in that moment, genuinely could not read. "I want Reeves to get his knee looked at," Jake said. "Same as when we started." Sergeant Holloway finally moved. He walked toward them with the careful, deliberate pace of a man diffusing something, hands slightly out at his sides. "Lieutenant," Holloway said, keeping his voice controlled, "I think we need to—" Davis's arm shot out sideways, not at Holloway, just stopping him, a wall of intent. "We're fine," Davis said, not looking away from Jake. "This is a conversation." "Sir? I said we're fine, Sergeant." Holloway stopped. He looked at Jake. Jake gave him the smallest possible shake of his head. "Don't." Holloway stayed where he was. Davis reached out and shoved Jake again. Open palm, center of the chest. And Jake took it the same way he'd taken the first one. One step back. Absorbed. Settled. "Stop taking it," Davis said. And there was something almost pleading in it now, buried under the aggression. Something that sounded like a man who needed the other man to swing back because the alternative, the quiet, the stillness, the unbroken composure, was doing something to Davis's understanding of the situation that Davis wasn't equipped to handle. "Stop just standing there." "Why?" Jake said. "Because—" Davis stopped, started again. "Because that's not what you do. When someone hits you, you fight back. That's what you do. That's what men do." Jake looked at him steadily. "I've got a daughter at home," Jake said. "She's 7. She thinks her stuffed triceratops is smarter than most adults." He paused. "I think she's right. And every decision I make out here has to be one I can explain to her when I get back. That's what I do." Something shifted in the air. It wasn't the words. It was the complete, unperformable sincerity with which they were delivered. The absolute absence of self-consciousness. Here was a man who had been grabbed and shoved and punched twice in front of an audience, and he was talking about his 7-year-old daughter and her dinosaur. Not because he was deflecting, not because he was performing humility, but because it was the most honest answer to the question that had been asked. Several of the soldiers shifted. A few looked at the ground, but not to avoid the situation. More the way people look at the ground when something true has been said, and they need a second to absorb it. Davis stared at him. Then something happened in Davis's face. It was fast, and it was involuntary, and it was, almost, the thing that could have ended this, right there, without what came next. For just a fraction of a second, the lieutenant looked like a man who had heard something that had landed in a place he hadn't expected. But it wasn't enough. Pride has a momentum of its own, and Davis's had been building for 8 months, and possibly a lifetime, and it did not stop in a fraction of a second. His hand moved to Jake's throat. Not a punch, not a shove. His fingers closed around Jake's neck. Not a full chokehold, but a grip, a claim. The kind of physical dominance that says, not, "I will hurt you," but "I own this situation, and I own you in it." "Last time," Davis said. His voice had gone quiet in a different way now. Controlled, but stripped down. "Walk away. Write your report. recommend your changes, and we will never have to have this conversation again. But if you keep standing here, looking at me like that—" "Like what?" Jake said. The grip was on his throat. His voice was steady. "Like you're waiting for something." "I'm not waiting for anything," Jake said. Davis tightened his grip, and Jake moved. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that would stay with every person in that yard for years afterward. How undramatic it was. There was no telegraphing, no wind-up, no visible decision being made. One moment Davis had his hand on Jake's throat, and then there was a shift, a pivot, a redirect. Weight moving not against the force, but with it, and then past it. And Davis found himself rotating, his own momentum being borrowed and returned. And then the ground was coming up very fast, and he hit the gravel on his back with a sound that knocked the breath completely out of him. And Jake's knee was on his chest. Not crushing, not punishing. Precisely placed, with the clinical accuracy of a man who knew exactly how much pressure was needed and applied exactly that much, and not 1 ounce more. Davis's wrist was in Jake's hand, one hand controlling the whole arm, in a leverage position that Davis's own training told him, instantly and completely, that he could not break. The whole sequence had taken approximately 2 seconds. The yard was so quiet that the distant sound of traffic outside the base perimeter was suddenly audible. Davis looked up. Jake looked down at him. The same quiet, the same eyes. Not triumphant, not angry, not cold. Just present. Completely, absolutely present. "You okay?" Jake said. Davis opened his mouth, closed it. "I've got your wrist at about 60% of what it takes to damage it," Jake said, still in that same even, almost conversational tone. "Your shoulder's in a position where if I move your arm 3 inches to the right, you're going to feel it for a month. Your sternum is fine. You've got full airflow." He paused. "I wanted you to know what's happening." Davis lay on his back in the gravel of his own training yard and stared up at the man he had grabbed and shoved and punched and choked. And he could feel 22 pairs of eyes on him. And he understood, with a sudden and total clarity, that the sound the room was making, the absolute silence of 22 people who were not breathing too loudly on purpose, was the sound of a thing being decided. Not about him and Jake, about something larger. Something about who these men were and what they valued, and what they understood strength to mean. "Who are you?" Davis said, quietly, just between them. Jake looked at him for a moment. "Jake Mercer," he said. "Same as this morning." "That's not what I mean." "I know." Davis swallowed. His wrist was still controlled, his shoulder still angled. He had not moved because some part of his training had assessed the situation and very clearly communicated that moving would be extremely counterproductive. "SEAL teams?" Davis said. "Yes." "How long?" 18 years. Davis closed his eyes, opened them. The gravel was pressing into the back of his skull, and he became very aware of it. "Where?" Davis said. "Places I can't name to you. Operations you haven't heard of. With men you'd never recognize on the street." Jake paused. "And with men who didn't come home. Who I think about every single day. Who had daughters and sons and people waiting for them, same as me." Another pause. "That's who I am, Lieutenant. That's what's on the other side of the notepad." Somewhere in the group of 22 soldiers, someone cleared their throat. It wasn't disrespectful. It was the involuntary sound of a person processing something that has hit them in a place they weren't braced for. Davis looked up at the sky for a moment. Just the sky. Pale and wide and enormously indifferent to the affairs of men in training yards. And then back at Jake. "I misjudged you," Davis said. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was something. The first crack in the foundation of whatever Davis had decided Jake was, splitting open just wide enough for daylight to get through. "Yeah," Jake said. He released Davis's wrist, lifted his knee from Davis's chest, stood and stepped back, and offered his hand. Davis stared at the hand. For most men, in most circumstances, this would be the easier part. Take the hand, get up, recover your dignity, and move forward. But Davis had never had to take a hand like this before, had never been in a position where taking it meant admitting, in front of his own unit, that he had been wrong and the other man had been right, and the hand being offered was not condescension, but something much harder to accept: grace. He took it. Jake pulled him to his feet, let go, stepped back. Davis stood in the middle of his training yard, and for a long moment he just stood there, breathing, getting the air back in, feeling the gravel dust on his uniform and the ache in his shoulder and the strange vertiginous sensation of a man who has lost his footing in more ways than one. "Reeves," Jake said, turning to the group. The young private stepped forward, startled to hear his name. "How long has the knee been bothering you?" Jake said. Reeves looked at Davis, then back at Jake. About 9-10 days, sir." "Have you reported it?" A beat. Too long. "Reeves," Davis said. His voice was different now, not less commanding, but different in some underlying way, the hard edge replaced by something more complicated. "Answer the question." "No, sir," Reeves said. "I didn't want to fall behind the unit." Davis said nothing. He just stood there and received that information. And something moved across his face that the soldiers closest to him said later they'd never seen there before. Something that looked, in a man who never looked it, almost like regret. "Sergeant Holloway," Jake said. Holloway stepped forward immediately, like a man who had been waiting for exactly this. "Sir, can you get Private Reeves to the medical facility? Right now. Please." Holloway moved. Reeves fell in beside him. As they passed Jake, Reeves glanced at him. Just a flicker, quick and young and uncertain, and Jake gave him a small nod. The kind that doesn't need words. The rest of the unit stood in the yard in the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something recalibrate. Davis turned and looked at them. His soldiers, his unit, the men he'd poured 8 months of himself into. And he saw that thing in their faces that he'd been reading all his career. He saw what they were taking from this. It wasn't contempt. That would almost have been easier. It was something that looked like reconsideration, like they were looking at him and making new room in their understanding of who he was and what that meant. Not writing him off, but not handing him the automatic trust he'd been working from either. He had to earn something new. He could feel it. And he had no idea, standing there in the yard dust, what earning it was going to cost him. Jake picked up his thermos from where it had been knocked over in the gravel. He checked it, still closed. He almost smiled at that. He looked at Davis. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'll share the full assessment with you and the CO before the meeting. I'd rather you hear it from me directly than read it cold." He paused. "There's a lot of good in what you've built here. I mean that." Davis looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you—" He stopped, started again. "After what just happened, why are you still—" "Because it's the job," Jake said simply. "I'm not here to make you look bad, Lieutenant. I'm here because those soldiers," he tilted his head toward the group, "are going to deploy somewhere. And when they do, I want every edge they have to be as sharp as it can be. That's the whole thing. That's all of it." Davis was quiet. And then, slowly, he nodded. It was a small nod, barely visible, but it was real. The kind of nod that costs something, that means something, that a man in Davis's position does not give away cheaply. Jake nodded back. He looked at the unit. 21 soldiers who had been through something in the last 20 minutes that none of them had seen on a training schedule. "Good session today," Jake said. "Straightforward, no irony. Get some food, hydrate, rest those shoulders. A few of you are going to feel the weighted carry tomorrow." A few of the soldiers exchanged glances. A couple almost smiled. One, a big sergeant in the back named Cole, who hadn't cracked an expression all day, made a sound that was definitely not a laugh, but was in the general neighborhood of one. Jake recapped his thermos, tucked his notepad under his arm. He started walking toward the building. Gravel under his boots, afternoon sun sitting low and warm on the back of his neck. Jaw throbbing steadily in a way he was already filing under things Lily can never know about this trip. He thought about calling her tonight, about Gerald the Triceratops, about peanut butter sandwiches with too much peanut butter. He was about halfway across the yard when Davis's voice came from behind him. Not commanding, not performing, just carrying across the quiet yard, man to man, the only two people in earshot. "Mercer." Jake stopped, turned. Davis was standing exactly where he'd left him, hands at his sides, uniform dusty. The whole weight of whatever this had been still sitting on his shoulders. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Davis said. "Nobody's ever—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I've never been wrong about a room before." Jake looked at him for a moment. "You weren't wrong about the room," Jake said. "You were wrong about me. Those aren't the same thing." Davis absorbed that. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I guess they're not." Jake held his gaze for one more moment. Steady, even. Nothing left unsettled between them. And then turned back toward the building. Behind him, he heard Davis turn to the unit and say, in a voice that was quieter and somehow more real than anything Jake had heard from him all day, "Get cleaned up. Report back at 1600 for debrief. And somebody get me Reeves' medical file before then." And the unit moved, without hesitation, without the particular energy of men performing compliance, with something that sounded, finally, like the real thing. Jake pushed through the door into the building, and the cool air hit his jaw, and he exhaled, long and slow and complete, and stood still for just a second. In his chest, where the ribs were bruised, there was pain. In his throat, where the grip had been, there was the memory of pressure. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the quiet place where Jake Mercer actually lived, below the training and the discipline and the 18 years of things he couldn't name in public, there was something that wasn't quite pride, because pride wasn't the right word. It was more like relief. Like a man who had spent a very long time knowing exactly who he was, and had been asked, today, to prove it to a room full of strangers, and had answered the question. The medical report on Reeves came back at 1547. Grade 2 medial collateral ligament strain, left knee. Accumulated load injury, consistent with repeated high-impact activity on a joint already under stress. The base physician's notes flagged it as preventable with earlier intervention and recommended 4 to 6 weeks of modified duty. No full weight-bearing drills. Possible physical therapy, depending on how the inflammation responded in the first 72 hours. Davis read it, standing at his desk, alone in his office with the door closed, and he read it twice. Then he set it down, put both hands flat on the desk, and stood there for a long moment, looking at nothing. 4 to 6 weeks. Reeves was 22 years old and one of the best natural athletes in the unit, and he'd been walking around on a joint that was quietly coming apart because he didn't want to fall behind his teammates, and because nobody, including the man responsible for this program, had caught it. Jake had caught it, from 15 feet away, on the first day. Davis pushed off the desk and walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the training yard, which was empty now, just gravel and fading light, and the long shadow of the obstacle wall cutting across the ground. He had been in the Army for 11 years. He had been an officer for 7. He had run training programs, led units, written assessments, received commendations. He had never, not once, had a day like today. Had never been taken down in front of his own men. Had never hit a civilian contractor in the jaw and then found himself on his back in the gravel before he'd fully processed what was happening. He kept coming back to the 2 seconds. That was the thing. 2 seconds. From Davis's hand on Jake's throat to Davis flat on the ground with his wrist controlled and his shoulder angled. 2 seconds. And not one of them telegraphed. Not one of them rushed. Not one of them carrying a single ounce of anger or ego or anything other than pure, applied precision. He'd been in combatives training for a decade. He knew what it looked like when someone was good. He knew the difference between technique and reflex, between a man who had learned how to fight and a man who had been forged by it over years until it was less a skill than a language his body spoke natively. Jake Mercer hadn't fought him. He'd simply redirected, borrowed the force and returned it, like physics, like breathing. Davis sat down in his chair and stared at the medical report. 18 years in the SEAL teams, operations he couldn't name, men who didn't come home, and a 7-year-old daughter, and a stuffed triceratops named Gerald. Davis pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and exhaled through his teeth. He had a lot to think about. 3 buildings over, Jake was on the phone. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk in the contractor quarters, a small functional room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, with an ice pack held against his jaw and the phone pressed to his other ear. And he was listening to the sound of his daughter attempting to explain, in real time, why Gerald deserved his own chair at the dinner table. "He's a triceratops," Lily said, with the tone of someone presenting an airtight legal argument. "Triceratopses were very important. They were the biggest ones." "They were definitely big," Jake agreed. "Bigger than the T-Rex." "That's debatable, actually." "Daddy." "Gerald gets the chair," Jake said. "Thank you." A pause. "Aunt Carol said he's a toy." "Aunt Carol is wrong." "That's what I said." Another pause, longer, the comfortable kind that existed between 2 people who had enough history together that silence didn't need filling. Then, quieter. "Are you okay?" Jake lowered the ice pack, looked at the far wall. "Yeah, baby. I'm okay." "You sound tired." "It was a long day." "Did you look for dinosaurs?" "I did. No luck yet." "Keep looking," she said, with complete seriousness. "They're probably hiding." He smiled. It pulled at his jaw and he didn't care. "I'll keep looking," he said. "Go eat your dinner, okay? And save Gerald's chair." "Okay." "Daddy?" "Yeah." "I love you to the moon." "I love you to the moon and back and all the way around again." She made a sound that was half laugh, half exasperated, and then she was gone. And the line was just quiet. And Jake sat with that quiet for a moment before setting the phone down on the bunk beside him. He pressed the ice pack back to his jaw. The ribs were worse than the jaw, honestly. The jaw was sharp and clean. It would bruise. It would fade. The ribs were deep, the kind of ache that shifts with every breath and reminds you of its presence every time you forget about it. He'd cracked ribs before, twice in training, once on an operation in a country he couldn't put in writing. These weren't cracked. They were bruised, which meant they would hurt for 2 or 3 weeks, and then stop. And there was nothing to be done except breathe through it. He was good at breathing through things. There was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He said, "Yeah," and the door opened and Sergeant Holloway leaned in, reading the room before stepping fully into it, the way experienced military men do when they're not sure of the temperature. "You got a minute?" Holloway said. "Sit down," Jake said. Holloway came in and sat in the single chair by the small desk, and he looked at Jake's jaw with the expression of a man who wants to say something about it, but is deciding whether that falls within the boundaries of the relationship. "How's Reeves?" Jake said. "MCL strain, modified duty. Doc says 4 to 6 weeks. Holloway paused. "He's okay. Mad at himself for not saying something sooner." "He shouldn't be," Jake said. "He's 22, and he didn't want to let his team down. That's not a character flaw. That's a training culture problem." Holloway nodded slowly. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Davis read the report." "I know he did. He's been in his office since 1600. Jake didn't say anything. "The unit's been talking," Holloway said carefully. "About what happened. About you." He seemed to choose his next words with the precision of a man navigating a minefield in the dark. "I don't know what your experience has been at other installations, but what happened out there today, that's the kind of thing that gets around a base fast." "I know," Jake said. He sounded neither pleased nor displeased about it. "I'd rather it didn't." "Not a lot you can do about it now." "No." Holloway looked at him. "You hit that floor fast," he said. "Davis, you put him down in about 2 seconds. 1.5, Jake said. Holloway absorbed that. "You could have done it sooner." It wasn't a question. Jake answered it anyway. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Jake set the ice pack down on the bunk. He looked at Holloway directly, the kind of direct that wasn't aggressive, just honest. The eyes of a man who had finished pretending a long time ago. "Because the point wasn't to put him down," Jake said. "The point was to not give him a reason to do more damage to himself. If I'd taken him apart the first time he grabbed me, what does that give his unit? Their commanding officer embarrassed in front of them before he's had any chance to understand what's happening. That's not good for them. That's not good for him. And it doesn't fix Reeves's knee." Holloway was quiet for a long moment. "So you let him hit you? Twice?" "I declined to stop him hitting me," Jake said. "There's a difference. That's a fine line. It's the only line that mattered today." Holloway leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms and looked at Jake with the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. 18 years in the teams," he said. "Yes, and now you're a contractor." "And now I'm Lily's dad," Jake said. "The contractor is the day job." Something moved across Holloway's face. Not pity. Jake wouldn't have tolerated pity, and Holloway probably knew that instinctively. More like recognition, the expression of a man who understood that there were different kinds of hard, and that the kind Jake was describing, building a whole life from scratch on the other side of loss, on the other side of everything he'd been for 2 decades, was its own particular form of courage. "Your wife," Holloway said, and then stopped, uncertain if he'd crossed a line. 3 years ago, Jake said. Even. Not closed, just settled. The way a man says something, he's said enough times that it no longer ambushes him. Aneurysm. She was 39. Lily was 4. Holloway didn't say he was sorry. Jake appreciated that. The sorry had been said 10,000 times in the last 3 years, and it never landed anywhere useful. "She was smarter than both of us," Jake said. "She would have had the Reeves situation flagged on day 1. The corner of his mouth moved. "She always saw what needed to be seen." Holloway nodded. He seemed to understand that the conversation had said what it came to say, and he stood and extended his hand and Jake shook it. Properly this time. Full grip. The handshake of two men who were square with each other. "Tomorrow's meeting," Holloway said. 800 with the CO. "You'll have the full assessment ready?" "Already written," Jake said. Holloway almost smiled. "Of course it is." He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. "For what it's worth, and I know you didn't do it for this reason, what those kids saw today is going to stay with them. Not just the takedown. All of it. The whole thing. The way you handled it." He paused. "That's the kind of thing that shapes people." Jake looked at him. "Go home, Sergeant," he said. Holloway went. In the morning, Jake arrived at the CO's office 7 minutes early. He always arrived 7 minutes early. It wasn't a habit exactly. It was more like a worldview. The men he'd trusted most in his life, the ones he'd gone through doors with, were men who arrived 7 minutes early. Lateness was a form of disrespect dressed up as a personality trait, and Jake had never had patience for either. Colonel Patricia Wentworth was already at her desk. She was 61, gray-haired, with the kind of posture that suggested the military hadn't given it to her. She'd been born with it, and the military had simply recognized a kindred spirit. She'd commanded 2 deployments and a training installation, and had the particular quality of great senior officers, which was that she never seemed to be performing authority. She simply had it, the way some people simply have height. She looked at Jake's jaw when he walked in, at the bruising that had gone from red to deep purple overnight. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," she said. He sat. "I read Sergeant Holloway's incident report," she said. No preamble, no small talk. Jake respected her immediately. "And I've spoken with Lieutenant Davis." "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me your version." So Jake told her. He told it the same way he'd written his operational reports for 18 years. Chronologically, factually, without editorializing, without self-defense, and without false modesty. He told her about the morning session and Reeves's knee. He told her about the afternoon confrontation, the grab, the 2 punches, the choke. He told her what he'd done, and why, and in what sequence. He did not characterize Davis's behavior beyond the facts of it. He did not frame his own actions as heroic. He simply told her what happened. She listened. She didn't take notes. She didn't ask questions until he was finished. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. "Davis told me substantially the same thing," she said, "including the parts that don't reflect well on him." She looked at Jake directly. "He didn't have to do that." "No," Jake agreed. "He asked me, specifically, not to file a formal misconduct charge against himself. He wants to handle the consequences through internal review." Jake nodded. He also asked if he could be present for the full assessment briefing. Wentworth paused. Not as a formality. He was specific about that. He said he wanted to hear every recommendation, good and bad, directly. She studied Jake. "That's not a small thing for a man like Davis." "No," Jake said. "It isn't." "What's your read on him?" Jake thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "He's got real talent," Jake said. "He reads a room well. He motivates effectively. He has genuine commitment to that unit." He paused. "And he's been the smartest person in every room he's been in for long enough that he's built his self-concept around it. That's fixable. It just requires the right kind of friction." Wentworth looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what yesterday was?" "Yesterday was messy," Jake said. "But yes, roughly." The CO considered that. Then she did something Jake hadn't expected. She smiled. Not broadly. A contained, controlled expression that nonetheless was clearly genuine. "My CO said something to me once," she said. 20 years ago. He said, "Wentworth, the difference between a good officer and a great one isn't how they perform when everything goes right. It's what they do with the first time everything goes wrong." She paused. "I think Davis is about to find out which one he is." "So do I," Jake said. Davis came in 3 minutes later. He was in full uniform, pressed and squared away, which was either discipline or armor or both. He looked at Jake when he walked in, and it wasn't the look from yesterday. Not the sizing up, not the performance. It was something more direct and more uncomfortable, and, Jake thought, more honest. He nodded. Jake nodded back. They sat across from each other at the conference table, and for the first time since Jake had walked into Fort Calloway, they were in the same room at the same temperature. "Before we start," Davis said. He said it to Jake, not to the colonel, though she was present and he was clearly aware of that. To Jake. "I want to say something." Jake waited. Davis put his hands flat on the table. He looked down at them for a moment, and it was the gesture of a man choosing between the easy version of a thing and the true version, and choosing the true version. "What I did yesterday was wrong," Davis said. "The first shove was wrong. The punches were wrong. The choke was wrong." He looked up. "Not wrong because you could have taken me apart at any point. That's not the point. Wrong because you were doing your job, and you were right about Reeves, and instead of hearing it, I turned it into something about me." He stopped. Then, "I want you to know that I know that." The room was quiet. "I appreciate that," Jake said. "I'm not asking for anything," Davis said quickly. "I'm not asking you to soften the assessment. I'm not asking you to leave anything out. I want the full picture." "You'll get it," Jake said. Davis nodded. He sat back. Something in his shoulders dropped exactly 1 degree. The barely perceptible release of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now willing to receive whatever comes next. Jake opened his folder. He had 12 pages of notes, formatted, cross-referenced, ordered from structural recommendations to specific drill modifications to personnel observations. He'd been awake until 01:30, making sure it was complete and fair and accurate. The same way he'd been awake late before every operational debrief he'd ever written. He put the first page on the table and started talking. He told them what worked. He was specific, named drills, named metrics, named individual soldiers who were performing above expectations, named the structural elements of Davis's conditioning program that were genuinely excellent. He meant every word of it, and both Davis and Wentworth could hear that he meant it, which is a different thing than simply being told positive information. And then he told them what needed to change. He was equally specific. The rest intervals, the form issues in the weighted carry, the rope technique, the culture, and he said that word carefully, knowing it was the one that would land hardest. The culture that had allowed Reeves to walk around on a compromised knee for 10 days because the environment had made him afraid to say so. Davis listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He asked 2 questions, both specific, both technical, both genuinely aimed at understanding rather than deflecting. By the second question, Jake had recalibrated his assessment of Davis again, moved him somewhere new, somewhere that had more possibility in it. This man could be very good, Jake thought, if he let himself be. When Jake finished, Wentworth asked several questions of her own. Detailed, incisive. The questions of a CO who understood both the operational implications and the human ones. Jake answered all of them. Davis added context in 2 places, and both times he did it without framing. Just information. filling in details that made the picture more complete. At 09:43, Wentworth said, "I want a full implementation plan for the recommended changes within 2 weeks. Davis, I want you to develop it in consultation with Mr. Mercer before he leaves the installation." "Yes, ma'am," Davis said. "Jake," she looked at him, "I want you to know that what happened yesterday will be addressed through formal channels. Davis has been fully cooperative, and that will be part of the record. But the incident will not go undocumented." "I understand," Jake said. "How's your jaw?" "It's fine, ma'am." She looked at it. "It doesn't look fine." "It's functional," he amended. The corner of her mouth moved. "Dismissed," she said. Jake and Davis walked out of the CO's office into the corridor, and for a moment they just walked side by side in silence. Not the silence of two men with nothing to say. The silence of two men who had already said a significant amount and were deciding what came next. It was Davis who spoke first. "The rope technique," he said. "The two guys you flagged, Kowalski and Reyes." "Yeah. I've been watching them do it that way for 3 months, and I couldn't tell you what was wrong with it." "The crossover on the descent," Jake said. "They're losing grip engagement on every cycle. It's not visible in the short run. Over time, you're burning their forearms out before any sustained operational load." Davis was quiet. "How do you see that?" Jake considered the question. It wasn't defensive, it was genuinely curious. The question of a man trying to understand something he wanted to understand. 18 years of watching people do things under pressure, until the difference between right and almost right becomes as obvious as a limp, Jake said. "You see it too. You just haven't had enough years of seeing it to know you're seeing it." Davis absorbed that. "And I would, given time." "Given time," Jake confirmed. "You're good at this, Davis. I mean that in the report, and I mean it here." Davis looked at him. "But?" "No but," Jake said. "Just good at it, with room to grow, same as everyone." They walked a few more steps. "My dad was a Marine," Davis said. 2 tours in Vietnam. He told me once that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who has nothing to prove." He paused. "I thought I understood what he meant." Jake didn't say anything. "I understand it better now," Davis said. They reached the point in the corridor where their paths divided. Davis toward the training bay, Jake toward the contractor quarters. Davis stopped, turned, extended his hand. Jake took it, firm, even, real. "The implementation plan," Davis said. "I want it to be right, not just compliant. Right." "I know," Jake said. "That's why I'm going to help you build it." Davis held the handshake one moment longer. "Yesterday," he said, "the thing you said, about your daughter, about every decision being something you could explain to her." He stopped. "I've got a son. He's 9. I haven't thought about it that way." Jake looked at him, at the man behind the uniform, behind the rank, behind the years of pride and performance. "Start," Jake said simply. Davis nodded, let go, and walked toward his unit. Jake watched him go for just a second. Then he turned and headed back down the corridor, ice pack waiting in his room, Lily's voice still somewhere in the back of his mind saying, "Keep looking, they're probably hiding." And the deep, certain quiet of a man who had come to Fort Calloway to do a job and was, against all the odds of yesterday, still doing it. The implementation plan took 4 days. Not because it was complicated. Jake had the bones of it drafted before the CO meeting was over. But because Davis wanted to understand every piece of it, And understanding took time when you were dismantling assumptions you'd built over 8 months and replacing them with something more honest. They worked in the evenings, after the unit was done for the day. Davis's office, door open, both of them at the small conference table with Jake's notes and Davis's program records spread between them. Coffee from the mess hall that was bad, but hot. Occasionally, one of the soldiers would walk past in the corridor and glance in, and then keep walking, and neither man acknowledged it. The first evening was the hardest, not because of anything that was said, because of what Davis had to sit with while things were being said. Jake would point to something in the data, a pattern in the performance metrics, a gap between what the program claimed to be doing and what the numbers actually showed. And Davis would look at it and absorb it in silence. And then ask a question, and Jake would answer, and Davis would nod, and the nod each time cost something visible. It was the Reeves data that landed hardest. Jake had gone back through the session logs, the records Davis kept on each soldier's performance across the program, and mapped out the pattern. Reeves's numbers on the left leg dominant drills had been declining in small increments for over 3 weeks. Not dramatically. The kind of decline that was easy to attribute to fatigue or a bad day or any of the 1,000 variables that make individual performance fluctuate. But the pattern was there, consistent and directional, if you were looking for it. "It's there," Davis said, looking at the chart Jake had put together. He said it quietly, the way a man confirms something he was hoping was wrong. "It's right there." "It's subtle," Jake said. "I should have seen it." "Maybe," Jake said, "but your monitoring system isn't set up to flag this kind of incremental change. That's a structural issue, not a personal failure. We fix the system, and it catches the next one." Davis looked at the chart for another moment. "Reeves is going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. "Yes. Because the system missed it." "Because the system missed it," Jake confirmed. He kept his voice level, not soft. Davis didn't need soft, just accurate. "And we build a better system, so the next Reeves gets caught at week 1 instead of week 3. Davis sat back. "In my head," he said, "I know you're right. The structural argument, the system argument." He stopped. "But Reeves trusted me with his development. That's not a system. That's a person." Jake looked at him. "Yeah," he said, "it is. So I carry that." "You carry it," Jake agreed. "And then you build something better, so you're carrying it for the right reasons, because you learn from it, not because it follows you around like a debt." Davis was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in his hands the way people do when they're thinking with more than just their brain. "You lost men," Davis said. It wasn't a question, not quite a statement, somewhere between. "Yes," Jake said. "And you carry those." "Every day." "How do you—" Davis stopped. "How do you keep going after something like that? How do you pick the next mission back up and not—" He searched for the word, "not freeze." Jake thought about it. He thought about the specific answer and whether Davis was asking because he needed to hear it or because the question itself was the point. The admission, from a man who had spent a career projecting invulnerability, that he understood now that carrying things was part of the work, and he wanted to know how to do it right. He decided Davis needed both. "The men I lost," Jake said. "They didn't stop. They were stopped. There's a difference. And the way I honor that difference is by not stopping when I don't have to. By doing the job. By being the person they would have wanted at their side, even when they're not there anymore." He paused. "Reeves isn't lost. He's going to recover. He's going to come back stronger if you build the right return protocol. That's where you put the weight, not into regret, into what you build next." Davis looked at him across the table. The office was quiet, except for the low hum of the ventilation and somewhere distant, a door closing. "I want to talk to him," Davis said. "Reeves. Not as his CO, just talk to him." "That's a good idea," Jake said. "Tell him what?" "The truth," Jake said. "That you missed it. That you should have caught it. That you're fixing the system so it doesn't happen to the next soldier." He met Davis's eyes. "He'll respect you more for it than for anything else you could say." Davis nodded slowly. He looked back at the chart. Then he picked up his pen and said, "Okay, show me the new monitoring protocol." And they went back to work. On the third day, Sergeant Cole came to find Jake. Cole was the big sergeant from the back of the formation, the one who'd made the almost laugh on the first afternoon, who'd said nothing during the confrontation, but whose silence had been, Jake had noticed, a different quality than the others. Not fear, not uncertainty. The silence of a man who was watching everything and filing it all away. He found Jake in the small gym off the main building, where Jake had gone in the early morning before the unit session to work through a mobility routine that helped manage the rib bruising. Cole knocked on the open door frame, and Jake said, "Come in," without looking up from the stretch he was in. Cole came in and stood. He was 6'4", and built like something that had been carved rather than grown, with a square, weathered face and eyes that suggested he was older than his rank would imply. A man who'd probably been offered promotions and declined some of them, which was its own kind of story. "You mind?" Cole said, gesturing vaguely at the space. "Room's yours," Jake said. Cole started warming up. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Not uncomfortable, just parallel. Two men doing the thing they were there to do. Then Cole said, without preamble, "My brother was a SEAL." Jake came out of the stretch, looked at Cole. "Was," Cole said, simply, leaving the word to do what it needed to do. "I'm sorry," Jake said. And he meant it in the way that people who've actually lost people mean it. Not as a social reflex, but as a genuine transmission of understanding. "Fallujah," Cole said. 2006. He was 26. "What was his name?" Cole looked at him. Most people didn't ask that. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Cole." Jake filed it away in the place where he kept the names. There were many names there. He'd long ago stopped thinking of that place as a wound. It was more like a room he carried with him, where he went sometimes to remember that the work meant something. "I've been watching you since you walked in," Cole said. He moved into a lunge, controlled and deep. "Watching how you move, the way you hold yourself. I knew what you were before Davis said SEAL. I knew it in the first hour." "Okay," Jake said. "I also knew what was going to happen the moment Davis got his back up," Cole said. "I've seen that look on Davis before, when he decides someone's beneath him. I wanted to say something." "Why didn't you?" Cole was quiet for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure what I was seeing yet. Whether you were what I thought you were, or whether I was just looking for Marcus." He paused. After what happened in the yard, I knew." Jake looked at him steadily. "What do you know?" "That you could have stopped it at any point," Cole said. "That you let him hit you twice, because taking him apart in 30 seconds in front of the unit would have destroyed something that couldn't be put back together." He stopped the lunge, straightened, looked at Jake directly with the eyes of a man who had been watching human beings under pressure for a long time. Marcus would have done the same thing. Jake held his gaze. "Was he good?" "He was the best person I've ever known," Cole said simply. "And one of the best operators. Both things at the same time." He paused. "I don't meet a lot of people who manage both." They stood in the small gym with that between them, which was not an uncomfortable thing, but a substantial one, the way some true statements are. "The unit," Jake said. How are they taking all this? Cole's expression shifted into something more measured. Mixed. The younger guys, they're still processing. They respect Davis. They've been running hard for him for 8 months, and they've seen results, and they trust that. And then they saw him hit you twice and get put on the ground in 2 seconds, and they don't quite know how to hold all of it yet. He paused. The older guys like me who've been around longer, I think we're relieved. Relieved? Jake repeated. There's been something off in this unit for a while, Cole said. Not bad exactly. Davis is a good commander in most ways, but something compressed, like there was pressure in the room that nobody was naming. And what happened in the yard named it. He looked at Jake. Sometimes that's what it takes. Jake nodded. Davis is working on it. I know. We can see the difference. It's only been a few days, but you can feel it. Cole crossed his arms. Yesterday, he stopped a drill mid-circuit because he saw Martinez's shoulder starting to compensate. 3 months ago, that drill runs to completion no matter what. Yesterday, he stopped it. Jake said nothing, but something in him settled, the particular settling of a man who did something at a cost, and is now seeing, in small and concrete ways, that the cost was worth it. I wanted to say thank you, Cole said, for not blowing it up worse than it had to be, for giving Davis a way back. He paused. For not making us choose between respecting him and knowing you were right. Jake looked at him for a long moment. Thank your brother, Jake said. He's the reason men like me know what that kind of restraint costs, and why it's worth it. Cole was still. Then he nodded, one deep, deliberate nod, and went back to his warm-up, and Jake went back to his, and they worked side by side in the quiet room, with the weight of all of it held between them. Not as a burden, but as something more like ballast, the kind that keeps a vessel steady in rough water. On the 4th evening, with the implementation plan complete and the documentation filed with the CO's office, Jake sat in Davis's office for the last working session, and they went through the final section, the personnel observations, the individual assessments, the recommendations for specific soldiers' development arcs. Davis had been different these last 4 days. Not unrecognizably different, still intense, still authoritative, still someone who took up room when he walked into it. But the intensity had been redirected, the way a river changes character when you shift the banks. Less pressure outward, more focus inward. He listened more. He asked more questions. Not performative questions designed to demonstrate engagement, but the genuine kind, the ones that meant he was actually building something in his understanding and needed information to do it. When they got to Cole and the personnel assessments, Davis leaned forward. What do you see in Cole? Davis said. More than his rank reflects, Jake said. Davis nodded. I've pushed him on promotion twice. He declines. I know why, Jake said. Davis looked at him. He told you about his brother. This morning. Davis was quiet. Marcus Cole was one of the best we've had come through, he said. I researched him after Marcus, Sergeant Cole, first declined promotion. Wanted to understand the man. He paused. Sergeant Cole stays enlisted because that's where Marcus was. Staying there is how he honors it. Yes, Jake said. Is that... Davis hesitated. Healthy? Psychologically? It's his, Jake said. You don't assess another man's way of carrying grief against some standard. You assess whether he's functional and excellent and present. He's all three. He met Davis's eyes. He's also the reason your unit held itself together in the yard on Monday. The younger guys were watching him as much as they were watching us. When he didn't move, they didn't move. When he stayed steady, they stayed steady. Davis absorbed that. I didn't know that. Now you do. Davis wrote something in his notes. Then he looked up. I want to recommend him for a unit leadership role. Not a promotion. A role. Something that uses what he actually is. Jake looked at him. A week ago, this man had grabbed him by the shirt and put 2 punches into him. Now he was sitting here, thinking about how to use a soldier's quiet grief in service of the men around him. "That's a good idea," Jake said. Davis wrote something else. Then he set the pen down and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then back at Jake. "When you leave," Davis said, "what happens to the assessment? Where does it go?" "The formal report goes to the CO and to the evaluation division. It becomes part of the program record." Jake paused. "The rest of it? What we've built in the last 4 days? That stays here. That's yours." "The CO is going to use the formal report in my performance review," Davis said. It wasn't a question. "Probably. Including the incident." "Yes," Davis nodded. "I deserve that." "You handled the aftermath well," Jake said. "That'll be in the report too." "That's not why I handled it well." "I know," Jake said. "That's why it'll be in the report." Davis looked at him. "You're an unusual person, Mercer." "So I've been told." "I mean it as the highest possible compliment." "I know," Jake said again. And then, because Davis looked like a man who needed to hear the actual thing, "You're going to be a good CO, Davis. Not just competent. Good. The difference between those 2 things is what you do with the moments you get wrong, and you've handled this one better than most would." Davis held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at his notes. His jaw worked once, the way it did when he was pressing something back down that had come up. "My son's name is Aiden," he said, out of nowhere, quietly. 9 years old. He plays baseball. He's terrible at it." A pause. "But he tries so hard, every single game. He just runs at it full speed and falls down and gets back up." Davis stopped. "I coach his team on weekends. I've been coaching it for 2 years, and I've never once told him I love watching him play. I tell him what he needs to fix. I tell him, good game. I tell him, we'll work on it." He stopped again. "I've never once said, I just love watching you play." The room was very quiet. Jake said nothing. "I'm going to say it," Davis said. "This weekend. I'm going to go home and I'm going to say it." He looked at Jake. "That thing you said, about every decision being something you can explain to your daughter." He exhaled. "I've been explaining a lot of things to Aiden that didn't need explaining, and not saying the one thing he actually needed to hear." Jake looked at him. At this man who had punched him in the jaw 4 days ago, and who was now, in a small office at the end of a long day, working out how to talk to his 9-year-old son. "Say it," Jake said. "This weekend. Just say it." "Yeah," Davis said. "I will." They sat with that for a moment. Then Davis looked at the clock on the wall, and Jake closed the folder, and they both pushed back from the table, and the 4 days of work sat between them on the desk. 12 pages of assessment, a monitoring protocol, a drill modification guide, a personnel development framework. The physical evidence of what 2 very different men had managed to build in the aftermath of something that could have left nothing standing. "I need one more thing from you," Davis said, as Jake stood and gathered the folders. Jake looked at him. "Reeves," Davis said. "I'm going to talk to him tomorrow. Like you said, just talk to him. Tell him the truth." He paused. "I want to know how to say it. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, and every version I come up with sounds like an excuse." Jake thought about it. He thought about all the times he'd had to say the hard, true thing to a person who deserved to hear it. To families. To men in hospital beds. to people who needed the real thing, and not the version that would make the person saying it feel better. "Don't start with the system," Jake said. "The system failure is real, and it matters. But it's not the beginning. The beginning is, I was responsible for your welfare, and I missed something I should have caught. Say that first. Exactly that. And then stop talking, and let him hear it." Davis held his gaze. "That's it?" Davis said. "That's the whole thing," Jake said. "Everything else follows from that. But you have to say that first, and mean it, and let it land before you move to what comes next." Davis nodded. He was already building the conversation in his head. Jake could see it. And for the first time, he thought Davis was building it the right way. Not as a performance, not as an exercise in damage control, but as something real between a commander and a soldier who had both been let down by a system and were now standing on the other side of it, trying to figure out what was owed. Jake picked up his folders, moved toward the door. "Mercer," Davis said. Jake stopped, turned. This was becoming a pattern, Davis catching him at the door with the one thing that hadn't been said yet in the room. Davis extended his hand. Jake shook it. "I owe you more than a handshake," Davis said. "You don't owe me anything," Jake said. "Put it in the program. Put it in the way you talk to Reeves tomorrow. Put it in the way you tell your son you love watching him play baseball." He held Davis's eyes. "That's where it goes." Davis released his hand, and Jake walked out into the corridor, and the base was quiet in the particular way of military installations at night. Not empty, never empty, but contained. The energy of the day settled into the structure of the place, held until morning. And he walked through it toward his room with the folders under his arm and his jaw still faintly aching and his ribs reminding him with every other step that the body keeps its own honest record of everything that happens to it, whether you acknowledge it or not. He called Lily when he got to his room. She was already in bed, which meant Carol answered first and said, in a voice that contained approximately 14 layers of sister, "Somebody has been asking if you called every 20 minutes since 7 o'clock. And then Lily was on the phone saying, "Daddy, I found a dinosaur book at school today, and Gerald and I read the whole thing." "Which one was your favorite?" Jake said. "The Ankylosaurus," she said without hesitation, because it had armor. Jake sat on the edge of his bunk. His jaw ached. His ribs ached. The folders with 4 days of work sat on the desk, and somewhere across the base, a man was figuring out what to say to his son about baseball. "Good choice," Jake said. "They were basically tanks," Lily said. "They really were." "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby." "Are you still okay?" He thought about the question. Really thought about it. In the 2 seconds before he answered, the way she deserved. "Yeah," he said. "I really am." Jake left Fort Calloway on a Friday morning. He packed the same way he'd arrived, efficiently, without ceremony, the duffel bag repacked in the same order it had been unpacked, the thermos washed and capped and stowed in the side pocket where it always rode. He stripped the bunk and left the linens folded at the foot of it. He checked the desk drawers twice. He did one final pass of the room, with the same systematic attention he'd given every space he'd ever prepared to leave. And then he closed the door behind him and didn't look back. Holloway met him at the front gate with the contractor paperwork. Signatures, equipment return receipts, the administrative tail end of 3 weeks that had been considerably less routine than the contract description had implied. They stood at the gate in the early morning cool and worked through the forms, and Holloway handed him a copy of everything in a manila envelope and said, "Safe drive." And Jake said, "Take care of this unit." And Holloway said, "Planning on it." And that was most of what needed saying between them. Jake put the duffel in the back of his truck. He opened the driver's door. stopped. Davis was walking across the yard toward the gate. Not running, just walking, with the measured pace of a man who has somewhere to be and has decided it's important enough to get there. He was in his PT uniform. The unit had an 0600 session starting in 20 minutes. And he looked, Jake thought, like a man who had slept better in the last few nights than he had in some time, which was the particular quality that comes not from the absence of hard things, but from having walked toward them directly. Davis stopped a few feet away. "You were going to leave without—" he started. "I said what needed saying," Jake said. "So did you." Davis looked at him. "Reeves wants to talk to you before you go." Jake checked his watch. He had time. "Where is he?" "Medical bay. He knows you're leaving this morning." Jake nodded. He closed the truck door. Reeves was sitting on the edge of the exam table in the medical bay, with his left leg extended and an ice pack strapped to his knee, looking like a man who had been doing a lot of thinking in a small room and had run out of things to rearrange. He was 22 years old, which, in the medical bay light, with the bravado of the training yard stripped away, looked very young indeed. He straightened when Jake came in. "At ease," Jake said, because the kid looked like he was about to stand at attention on one good leg. Reeves settled. Jake pulled the chair from beside the desk and sat down across from him, which put them at the same level, which Jake had decided before he walked in was the right geometry for whatever this was. "How's the knee?" Jake said. "Sore," Reeves said. "Better than Tuesday." He paused. "Doc says I can start modified load week after next if the inflammation keeps coming down." "Good," Jake said. "Stay in front of it. Do the PT even when you think you don't need it, especially then." "Yes, sir." They were quiet for a moment. Reeves looked at his hands. "Lieutenant Davis came and talked to me yesterday," Reeves said. "He told me—" He stopped. Started again. "He told me he missed it, that he should have caught the knee, that it was on the program and not on me." He looked up. "I've never had an officer say something like that to me." "How did it land?" Jake said. Reeves thought about it with the honesty of a young man who hadn't yet learned to give pre-packaged answers to serious questions. "Weird at first," he said, "because you don't expect it. And then—" He paused. "And then I just felt like, okay, we're square. Like something that was kind of sideways between me and the whole situation just went straight again." Jake nodded. "That's what it was supposed to do." "Did you tell him to say it?" "I told him how to say it," Jake said. The saying it was his. Reeves considered that. "He's different this week," he said. "The whole unit's talking about it. Not in a bad way, just—" He stopped a drill mid-circuit Wednesday because Martinez's shoulder was off. He looked at Jake. 3 weeks ago, that doesn't happen." "What does that tell you?" Jake said. Reeves thought again. "That he's paying attention to different things than he was before." "What things?" "Us," Reeves said simply. "Like the actual people, not just the metrics." He paused. "Is that what you were trying to do when you came here?" "I was trying to make the program better," Jake said. "The program is the people. So yes." Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not looking up, "I heard what you said in the yard, about your daughter, about every decision having to be something you can explain to her." He paused. "I've been thinking about that a lot this week." "Yeah?" "I've been thinking about why I didn't report the knee." He looked up. "It wasn't just not wanting to fall behind. I mean, that was part of it. But the bigger part was—" He stopped. "I didn't want anyone to think I wasn't tough enough. Like, if I said it hurts, that meant something was wrong with me, not just with my me." Jake looked at him steadily. "That's a version of something I've seen kill people," Jake said, not harshly, just true. Not the injury, the silence around it. The idea that saying, "I need help," is a confession of weakness instead of an act of operational intelligence. He paused. The toughest men I've ever known were the ones who could take an honest inventory of their condition and report it accurately, because those were the ones you could count on when the situation was real. You always knew where they actually were. Reeves absorbed that. "I'm going to remember that," he said. "Good," Jake said. "Put it somewhere solid." Reeves nodded. Then, with the slight awkwardness of a young man who has something to say and isn't entirely sure how to get there, "I wanted to say thank you for seeing the knee when nobody else did, and for the way you handled everything after. You didn't have to do any of that." "It's the job," Jake said, which was what he always said and what he always meant, and which also was never quite the whole of it, but was the part that translated. Reeves extended his hand. Jake shook it, firm and direct, the handshake of two people who have met in a moment that meant something, and are acknowledging it without overstating it. "Get the knee right," Jake said. "Come back strong. Your unit needs what you've got." Reeves straightened on the exam table. Not military straight, just the straight of a young man who has been told something real about himself by someone whose opinion he's decided to trust. "Yes, sir," he said. Jake was at the truck, door open, 1 foot in, when he heard his name from across the yard. Not Davis this time. Cole. The big sergeant was standing at the edge of the training area with 3 other soldiers. The morning session gathering, the unit assembling for 0600 in the way they always did. In the way soldiers have assembled at every hour of every morning since men first decided that the group surviving required the individuals within it to show up on time and ready. Cole walked toward him. The others watched from where they stood. He stopped in front of Jake. He looked at him for a moment, that long, reading look that Cole had been giving him since day one. The look that Jake had understood from the beginning was the look of a man who had learned to see carefully, because seeing clearly was how he honored someone he'd lost. "My brother would have liked you," Cole said. Jake held his gaze. "I would have liked to know him." Cole nodded. He didn't extend his hand. Something about the moment didn't call for it. He just stood there, solid and present, and they were square with each other in the particular way of two people who have shared something that doesn't require further ceremony. "Take care of yourself, Mercer," Cole said. "You too, Sergeant," Jake said. "Take care of them." Cole looked at him one more moment. Then he turned and walked back to the group, and Jake could hear him calling the unit to order in a voice that was quieter than Davis's, and somehow, because of that, more complete. Jake got in the truck. He was 40 minutes out of Fort Calloway, on the long, straight highway that ran between the base and the nearest town, when his phone rang through the truck speakers. "Carol," he answered. "She's been up since 5:30, Carol said, without preamble, "asking every 20 minutes if you're on your way." "Tell her I'm on the road," Jake said. "I've been telling her that. She wants to hear it from you." A pause. "Hold on." There was the sound of small feet on a hard floor, moving fast. And then Lily's voice came through the truck speakers, like something that rearranged everything in the cab. "Daddy, are you driving?" "I'm driving," he said. "Are you coming home today for real?" "For real," he said. "Okay." A pause. "I made you something." "Yeah? What'd you make?" "You'll see when you get here," she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been keeping a secret and is very good at it. Gerald helped. What did Gerald contribute specifically? "Ideas," she said seriously. "He's the idea guy." Jake drove. The highway was flat and long, and the morning light was coming in sideways through the passenger window, and somewhere ahead of him were peanut butter sandwiches and a stuffed triceratops named Gerald, and the 7-year-old who thought armor was the most interesting evolutionary development in the history of life on Earth. And Jake was going toward all of it, the way he'd gone toward every important thing in his life, deliberately, without looking away, with the full weight of himself committed to what was ahead. "Lily," he said. "Yeah?" "I love you to the moon." "To the moon and back, and all the way around again," she said. "Exactly on cue. Exactly right." "Exactly right," he said. She talked for the next 12 minutes about the Ankylosaurus book, and about a drawing she'd done at school, and about something Gerald had apparently said in a dream. She reported this without irony, and Jake received it the same way. And then Carol took the phone back and said, "Just get here." And Jake said, "Hour and a half." And Carol said, "She'll be at the window," and hung up. He drove. He thought about Reeves, who would do his physical therapy and come back strong and carry what he'd learned about silence into every room he entered for the rest of his career. He thought about Cole, steadying the unit from the back of the formation the way he'd been doing all along, the way he would keep doing, carrying his brother's name in the quiet place where it lived. He thought about Holloway, solid and watchful, the kind of man every installation needs and rarely acknowledges until he's gone. He thought about Davis. Davis, who was probably running the 0600 session right now, who had probably paused somewhere in it already to check a form, to watch the way someone's foot landed, to do the small act of paying attention that was both very simple and, for a man who'd spent years looking at the big picture and trusting the small one would take care of itself, genuinely hard-won. Who had a son named Aiden, who played baseball badly and with his whole heart, and who was going to hear his father say, "I love watching you play this weekend," and who would not know the full chain of events that had produced that moment, but would carry it forward in his own way, regardless. That was how it worked. You moved through the world, and you left things in it, and most of them you never saw again. But they were there. The mechanic who tightened the bolt you never knew was loose. The teacher who said the one sentence a person needed to hear to stop stopping themselves. The man who sat in a small room with a man who had hit him for 4 evenings and helped him build something better out of the aftermath. All of it invisible. All of it real. Jake had spent 18 years doing invisible, consequential work. He had been good at it. He had been built for it, or built himself for it. After enough years, it was impossible to say which. And it had asked everything of him, and he had given everything. And the giving had cost him in ways that didn't show on paper, in ways that lived in the room he carried inside him with all the names. And now he drove a truck on a flat highway toward a daughter who had made him something with help from a stuffed triceratops. And this was also invisible work. And it was also consequential. And it also asked everything of him. And he gave everything. And none of it was lesser than what came before. It was the same commitment in a different arena, for different stakes. The stakes were, in every way that actually mattered, higher. He thought about something the last officer he'd served under had said to him, on the day Jake turned in his papers and separated from the Navy. The man had looked at him across the desk and said, "You know what makes a SEAL different from every other operator?" Jake had said he did. The officer had shaken his head. "No," he'd said. "The thing that makes a SEAL different is not the training. It's that the training never stops applying. It applies to everything, forever. Every room, every relationship, every decision." He'd looked at Jake directly. "That doesn't go away because you take the uniform off. You take the uniform off, you're still that person. You carry it into everything you do for the rest of your life. That's what we build. That's what stays." Jake had understood it then. He understood it more completely now. He understood it in the way Davis had looked at him across the desk on the last evening, rebuilding the thing he'd built badly, into something that would hold. He understood it in Cole's voice when he said, Marcus. Just the name, just the single word that was the whole weight of a brother, and a loss, and a life continuing in the direction that loss had pointed it. He understood it in Reeves's hand in his, firm and young, and trying to become the kind of man who said the hard, true thing about his condition, instead of walking on a compromised joint for 10 days because he was afraid to look weak. He understood it in Lily's voice, through the truck speakers, saying, For real? You're coming home? For real? He understood it in all of it, in the way all of it was the same thing, the same training, the same discipline applied at different scales to different material. The material of human beings trying to be better than their worst impulses, trying to see past their own pride and fear and the comfortable stories they told about themselves, to the harder, truer thing underneath, and then trying to act from that place instead of the easier one. That was the job. All of it was the job. The base came down to a point in his rearview mirror and disappeared. Ahead, the road opened up. When he pulled into Carol's driveway, the front door opened before he had the engine off. Lily came down the porch steps at the particular speed of a 7-year-old who has been waiting for something long enough that the arrival of it requires her entire body to participate. She was wearing pajamas with dinosaurs on them. Of course she was. And her hair was in 2 lopsided ponytails that suggested Carol had tried and Lily had modified. And she was holding something flat against her chest with both arms, protecting it. Jake got out of the truck. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. She looked up at him with the full force of her attention, which was, as it had been since the first day he held her in the hospital, with his hands shaking and his chest full of something he didn't have words for yet, the most powerful thing he had ever encountered in his life. More focused than any debrief, more disarming than any opposition, more true than anything a person could manufacture. "You're home," she said. "I'm home," he said. She held out the thing she'd been carrying. It was a drawing, crayon on construction paper, the particular competent style of a child who has not yet been told that art requires precision. A man in brown, which Jake supposed was his jacket, standing next to a large green shape that he understood, after a moment, was a dinosaur. Specifically, an ankylosaurus. Specifically, because it had what appeared to be armor plates, rendered in careful green and brown, and what might have been orange. Underneath, in careful block letters that were perfectly legible and slightly uphill, "Daddy and the dinosaur he found." Jake looked at it for a long moment. "Gerald helped with the armor," Lily said. "He knows how it goes." "It's perfect," Jake said. And then, because she was looking at him with that look that meant she was checking his sincerity with a fine-tuned instrument she'd been calibrating since she was old enough to understand the difference between the things people say and the things they mean. "I mean that. This is genuinely perfect." She seemed satisfied. She let him hug her, which she did by tucking herself under his arm in the specific way she'd always done it, like a key in a lock, like she was made for exactly this space and had always known it. He held on. He held on the way a man holds on when he knows what it costs to let go, and knows also that the holding is the point, that this, right here, this particular weight in his arms, this dinosaur pajamas and lopsided ponytails and crayon drawing, is not the consolation prize for everything that came before. It is the thing itself. The whole thing. Carol was on the porch, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had been holding things together for 3 weeks, and was ready to hand that job back, and wasn't going to be emotional about it. She was absolutely being emotional about it. "There's coffee," she said. "Thank you," Jake said. "I want to hear nothing about what happened at that base," she said. "I want to drink coffee and watch Lily show you the Ankylosaurus book. And I want a completely normal Saturday." Jake looked at her over Lily's head. She was looking at his jaw. The bruising had faded from purple to the particular greenish yellow of an injury in its last week, which was less alarming than the purple had been, but still clearly there. "It's fine," he said. "It doesn't look fine," she said. Exactly what Wentworth had said. "It's functional," he said. Carol looked at him for a moment longer. The look of a sister who has known a person their entire life and has made a long-standing agreement with herself to trust their judgment even when she wants to overrule it. And then she nodded once and went back inside toward the coffee. Lily pulled back and looked up at him. She reached up and touched his jaw very gently with 2 fingers, the careful way she did everything she decided required care. "Does it hurt?" she said. "A little," he said. Because she was 7 and she was asking, and the honest answer was yes. She considered this with the seriousness she gave to important things. "Gerald says armor doesn't always have to be on the outside," she said. Jake looked at her. "What does he mean by that?" Jake said. Because in his experience, Gerald's ideas were worth following to their conclusion. "He means that the part that doesn't get hurt is the inside part," she said. "The feeling part. If you keep that safe, the outside part can heal." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Gerald is very smart," he said. "I know," she said. "I told you." She took his hand and pulled him toward the house, toward the coffee and the Ankylosaurus book and the completely normal Saturday that Carol had requested. And Jake went, letting himself be led, which was its own form of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that knows when to follow and when to lead, and can tell the difference. And the door closed behind them, and the morning settled into the house, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done. And the man who had arrived at Fort Calloway 3 weeks ago, with the duffel bag and the thermos, and the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable, left it the same way, and left it better, and drove home to his daughter, and that was the whole of it. And that was enough. It was, in every way that had ever mattered to Jake Mercer, exactly enough.